We are now going to go into a bit of a scene setter. A lot of what has been mentioned in the opening ceremony is quite relevant to this conversation. Quite simply, what we are looking at is the global economic outlook. Everyone in this room is aware of what the last 2.5 years have been like. Not only are we still coming to grips with the fallout of the coronavirus pandemic, which has kind of fallen out of the headlines in recent months due to events unfolding in other parts of the world. We all know what's happening in Ukraine. But just as a gentle reminder, or not so gentle reminder, events in China over the last week have underlined that we are far from done with COVID. We are entering into a period of, I think, politely put, severe global economic uncertainty. And I'm reminded of a session that I chaired at the Heads of Government meeting in Kigali in June, which included Donald Kaberuka, the former president of the African Development Bank, and I think he summed it up quite nicely. He said, crisis is the new normal. So we want to address this issue of what kind of world are we heading into? And importantly, trying to take a forward-looking approach. What's the response? Because that, of course, is the key question. Yeah? It's a reality we have to deal with. The question is, how do we deal with that? With me to unpack this a little bit are Dr. Jean Ingabitsinze, who is the Minister of Trade and Industry from Rwanda, the Right Honourable Nick Thomas Simmons, who is the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade in the UK, and Grant Reid, who is the outgoing CEO of Mars International. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Nick, I've got some briefing notes here, and I'd like to turn to you to kick us off, because like many people, I read the news, and pretty much everything I read about the global economy these days is bad news. Just before we got on here, I did a quick Google of global recession, and it was pretty depressing.
I'm sure.
Now, the question I've got for you that I've been supplied with, very simple, help us out here. What is the current state of the global economy? Step one. Step two, does it have the ability to quickly recover from where we are? And step three, how do we make that a reality? And step four, what's the role of the Commonwealth in this? So a nice, easy question to kick us off. Enlighten us. What is the state of the global economy?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for such a straightforward opening question. It's much appreciated. But it's wonderful to join you here at the Commonwealth Trade and Investment Summit. This really is an important gathering, and I'm delighted to be able to come along today and to share some thoughts with all of you. Let's just start, though, with the position that we're in, the state we're in, if you like. Clearly, here in the United Kingdom, we've been through a period of political and economic turbulence, and we've clearly got a tough winter to come, and that is in the context of this global downturn. We know that is because, as has already been said, the impact of COVID, it's about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also the huge challenge of climate change, which I want to come back to in a moment. And whilst the global economy is cyclical, it has its ups and downs, it really does feel as if the global downturn and the other events that we've discussed have exposed things like system frailties that do mean that we have to and should do things in a different way. And I want to talk specifically here about the Commonwealth, because I think the Commonwealth really is central to the other questions that have been put to me to open this session. The Commonwealth really can lead the way. Can we recover quickly was the question that was put to me. I think we can recover quickly, but it will be in partnership working. And the Commonwealth is a cornerstone of that partnership working around the world. And I was just noting down earlier some of the things that we can work in partnership on, that just and secure transition to sustainable energy with access to green finance. Food security, of course, goes hand in hand with that. Health technology and delivery, human rights, security, all these things we can work together to make that swift recovery a reality. The Commonwealth is vital because in trade terms, what we all know is there is a very real Commonwealth advantage. And if we are to have that export-led sustainable growth, which I believe is vital to the recovery of the global economy, to create that sustainability not only in relation to tackling climate change, but also in relation to supply chains, which have clearly been disturbed by the external shocks, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But that Commonwealth advantage is very real. There are various statistical analyses, some of which say it's a 27% advantage, and it's no surprise that that is the case. The Commonwealth is a place where it is easier and cheaper to trade, with those deep historic ties, the familiarity of the administrative and court systems, the language, the deep cultural links. So whilst there is that shared past, there is that partnership present, there can also be, even in these very tough global times, in my view, a real sense of optimism about what we can achieve together as the Commonwealth, not only to recover from the economic situation we find ourselves in now, but also to build a real sustainable future that can bring prosperity to all our nations.
Thank you, Nick. If I can just throw a quick follow-up at you and maybe put you on the spot a little bit. It's very bullish, quite optimistic, surprisingly so. I'm glad to hear it. You say we can recover quickly. If you were a betting man, would you say we will?
I would say, well, it depends, doesn't it, what we mean by quickly. We look at the previous global downturns. I mean, I certainly don't believe this is going to be as long, for example, as the 1930s downturn, which after 1929 lasted for so long. I'm not saying that the global economy can recover in a matter of months, absolutely not. But it can recover. If you look at previous global downturns, can it recover more quickly? Yes, absolutely, it can. But it is by a recognition of our mutual interdependence and the need that we have to recover in partnership, with a recognition as well that the world has changed. What this global downturn has exposed around resilience, whether that is in terms of food security, in terms of trade resilience, in terms of climate resilience, all those things now have to be central to our sustained recovery.
Thank you, Nick. There's a couple of things that really stand out there. The need for partnership and the emphasis on partnership, and the need to do things differently, recognizing the world has changed, themes that we will expand upon. Minister, I'd like to turn to you next. We have listed many of the challenges that the world faces. In an African context, in a sub-Saharan African context, some of the issues that have really come to the fore, particularly in the last 12 months, are things like the energy transition, climate change, and the impact that is having, food security, or the lack thereof, unfortunately. And in a context of tightening global financial conditions, there's also increasing pressure on many African governments in terms of fiscal space and debt levels. When you give us a bit of a sense from the Rwandan perspective, looking at this shifting global economic outlook, a worsening outlook in many ways, how do you respond? How's Rwanda responding? Could you give us an idea of what some of the priorities are to ensure that this doesn't turn into a full-blown crisis, so to speak?
Thank you so much. We are happy to be here to discuss about the global economy and the issues around. Of course, Rwanda is a part of the global world. If we take an example and we go back almost 14 years ago, 2009, 2007, during the financial crisis, countries try to adjust their policies and strategies to make sure that they can recover quickly from the shocks. 14 years later, or 15 years later, between 14 and 15, pandemic, global pandemic. This was very, very aggressive in terms of covering almost the world, it covers all the world. And then, of course, Africa in particular, as we have said, is sub-Saharan Africa, because of some challenges we have in our economy, mainly on productivity, we suffered, we can say we suffered more. So what we did in Rwanda is to make sure that we adjust our policies and strategies to make sure that we can recover quickly. Of course, the external factors continue to impact what we do in terms of recovering. But if you see numbers today, you can say we can count now on 6-7% growth of GDP. 2 years ago, we were under in terms of numbers. So we are adjusting what we see in terms of increased productivity through manufacturing. We are revising our industrial policy. We are revising our trade policy. And of course, we are aligning our country to global regional blocks like African Total Free Trade, where Rwanda is participating as a piloting country, trading with other countries under rules of origin. So I think what Rwanda is doing is what many countries have to do in terms of recovering quickly, is opening. Sometimes when there is a shock, countries tend to close their economy. But when you close, you create more inefficiencies. So Rwanda, we hope to open more, and of course, we try to put in place a mechanism of funding. You have, for example, a fund called Manufacturer and Ability to Recover to support manufacturers and other people to invest in terms of production to make sure that they can afford the investment. So this is one of example. Then, working with Africa to free trade, there are opportunities. And I think here Commonwealth can even support on that because we have now 1.3 billion people in Africa, and we can have more than 3 trillion of GDP in 3 years. So if we easy and we try to eliminate non-tariff barriers because they have a high cost and it creates a high cost in terms of transactions, I think together we will be able to have a sustainable economy. But you have to do what? You have to make sure that we open. Open is not enough, but we partner to share resources. Share resources is not enough, but we find a way to finance our economies together. Is what I can say for now. Thank you.
Thank you. How concerned are you about the issue of debt and fiscal space in a Rwandan context? You have to forgive me, I am not aware of the debt to GDP ratio in Rwanda as well at the moment, but this is something that comes up time and time again, especially as we are looking at a global recession. There's concern that fiscal space might be limited in many African countries. Is this a concern in the Rwandan setting? And if so, how are you approaching it to make sure that it doesn't become too much of a problem?
Thank you so much. The fiscal space, of course, the cost of money is expensive, not only for Rwanda, but I think for many. But in our 2050 vision, we want Rwanda to become in 2035 a middle income, meaning that around 4,000 per capita. Then in 2050, arriving at a high income, meaning that around 20 to 12,000 per capita. What is meaning that? It means that is having a country as a hub of financial institutions like we have International Finance Center, and make sure that we can reduce the cost of production. Reducing the cost of production, meaning that innovations through digital trading, through industrializations, through innovations. So we hope, it's not easy, I can say, because as long as you can't print money, you have always to make sure that your policy, your monetary policy is going in terms of controlling what you do in terms of investment. But as Rwanda, we want to be a hub of financing institutions, so we can make sure that we access easily the money to be reinvested. Another thing we see in Rwanda to make sure that our fiscal can become more friendly to our investors is to collaborate with our neighbors. So we have an informal market, very important. Of course, it is require infrastructures around what we do. Infrastructures of trade, they are another one component to invest on. Then the capacity building and the skills to understand the global shocks, the global variations. You see it's dynamic, so to make sure that you can align yourself to dynamism around the trade, you have to train people to understand that, to model. The prediction will be very important in the future. Have you seen the pandemic of COVID? I can say even experienced economists have been caught in trouble because we have not been able to predict. If you can put together data globally and work together to make sure that we can predict or we can be prepared to the future pandemic, I think it will be easy. But as I have said, no single country will be able to do it alone. We must work together. And I think Commonwealth, as I said, they can support us. If you see the program we have and the business forum we have had, I think this is a sign of how people can work together and win together. So it's a win-win situation, but everyone must put the efforts and must support positively what the community want to do around Commonwealth.
Thank you very much. Again, they're reiterating the importance of partnership. Grant, I'd like to turn to you. A couple of things have come up: climate change, food security, stroke agriculture. The two are obviously go hand in hand. When we hear the word Mars, we all know the iconic chocolate bar, but of course the company does a lot more than that. And agriculture and food security are quite relevant to what Mars does. We've just come out of the COP27 summit in Egypt, which has underlined even further the importance to drive climate action, the importance to drive sustainability. Give us a bit of a sense of what this looks like from the private sector side. Looking at this dimming global outlook, how do you drive growth while also driving sustainability? Key challenges.
It's a great question. So first of all, it's an honor to be with you at the Commonwealth Trade and Investment Summit. I met many of you at CHOGM and had the opportunity to talk about some of these issues with many of you. And I've traveled. Mars is a $45 billion global company, so we've invested obviously billions of dollars in Commonwealth countries. So I heard growth, trade, climate uncertainty, food security, and partnership, and they're all intertwined. And if you look at the current trade between Commonwealth countries, it's some in the region of 700 billion, looking to get that to a couple of trillion over the next 7 or 8 years. And that growth, a lot of it is going to come from agriculture and trade between the Commonwealth states, and it has to be based on sustainable production. And it has to ensure that the trade is fair and balanced across all the countries and all the people in that supply chain. And that can be done. And so I'll give you an example. So Mars, over the last 8 years, has grown about 50% and about 28% in volume. Yet at the same time, we've cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 6 to 7% in total. In our scope 1 and 2, we've cut that by 30%. So the ability to grow and still ensure that we're doing better for the planet is absolutely critical. So for many Commonwealth countries sitting in the audience, particularly Pacific states, this isn't just a theoretical argument. This is really the difference between life and viability itself. And I think the partnership between, it's great to have this panel, the partnership between private sector, public, and NGO is going to be absolutely critical to the success. And I can elaborate that on that later.
Yeah, actually, I think it would be good to elaborate on that right now because,
Sure.
In many ways, well, it's always been important, right? More important than ever when you look at the state of the world right now. Does that also mean it becomes more complicated than ever?
Yes, it's definitely more complicated, and it was interesting you were talking about the new normal, and I think with climate change, it's going to be the new abnormal unless we fix it. And so a good example of that partnership within the Commonwealth is the initiative under His Majesty King Charles III, then His Royal Highness, bringing together public and private together. And he asked me to lead his agribusiness task force. And it's made up of a great combination of potential competitors all the way through the supply chain. So it's a very uncommon collaboration. And the reason we did that is because about a third of the world greenhouse gas comes from agriculture. And yet, many of the fixes to that are very well known. So regenerative agriculture is very much like the agricultural systems we used 100 years ago, which is disturbing the soil very little, putting in only the nutrients that are absolutely required, retaining the water within it, And yet, only 15% of the world is using those regenerative agricultural techniques. And we've got to get that up in the next 7 years to more like 45%. So we've got to triple the penetration of regenerative agriculture. And if we do that, that's going to take out 600 million tons of greenhouse gas and give us a possibility of hitting the 1.5 degree target, which is absolutely essential to many Commonwealth countries sitting in the audience today. And that is going to take incredible partnership. It's got to fund the farmer to do it, so it's going to take a change in private company approaches to how we buy commodities, and I can give examples of that. It's going to take government change in policy to make sure our farm bills and government agricultural practices and funding is geared towards regenerative agriculture. And it's going to take NGOs all working together.
Very quick follow-up before I bring Nick in on this. Looking at the state of the global economy, are you worried?
I've always found that worrying doesn't really help. And so I'm really based on action and thinking about what action can we take to reduce uncertainty. And I think, as a leader, I think I've learned in the last 4 or 5 years that you've got to be dialing up listening and empathy and providing importing stress and exporting calm and taking balance and timing. And the right decision at the wrong time is still the wrong decision. So my role as a CEO is probably a little bit easier than government in that I can make decisions that I can vary over time and just gradually change rather than drastic changes. So it's about balance and timing, dialing down uncertainty. I don't have time for worrying.
Okay, good answer. Nick, you wanted to comment on this?
I just want to pick up on the point about agriculture because I think it's such an important point, because when we are looking at net zero, when we're looking at how we reach that target, we do of course focus quite rightly on heavy industry. We are looking at things like technology around carbon capture and storage, other emerging technologies, and that's of course very, very important. But the thing that I really take from this is not to neglect agriculture, because after all, we're talking about 1/3 of the total emissions. All I would add really to what's been so ably set up by Grant is that there is this issue around the new normal, this issue of, in one sense, we have to go backwards in the sense that 100 years ago, these were the kind of methods that were being used. However, we also need to go very much forwards in terms of approach, in terms of training, as we discussed earlier,
Yes.
but in terms of at times where you have farms that are using particular methods, particular traditions that they've used now over a few generations, we have to look at how we can put the support in that is necessary for change. But it's a support to make sure that there's an economic viability going forward as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
What's going to catalyze the kind of action that we need to see? Because it's not that difficult to kind of figure out, look, if we put this in place, X, Y, and Z, we can make an impact, right? We've got enough evidence and technology around the world. We kind of know how this works. But it's easier said than done, because often, even with the best solutions, action is often lacking. Grant, maybe coming back to you, and sticking with the theme of I don't like to worry, get things done. On what basis could we expect things to actually catalyze here?
Yeah, so I like to think of myself not as a climate activist, but as a climate actionist. And so if you look at what's been done over the years, and we still do need activists to hold us to account, but I think we've gone from a situation where, His Majesty the King was talking about climate 50 years ago, and I wasn't a believer. I think he was thinking ahead of his time. So we do need that activism for awareness. But I think the awareness is much, much higher now than it's ever been. But then we need to move to commitments. And, we heard, I was at Glasgow and I was in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP26 and COP27. We've got a lot of commitments now, both from countries and from governments. But it can't stop there. The next phase has to be action. And when I say action, I mean clear metrics of how you're going to measure the commitment, transparency around publishing those metrics, both for countries and for companies, and then consequences if those metrics aren't hit. And those consequences could be the market cap of a company, it could be shareholder pressure from those, it could be government intervention and costs, but there has to be that. If you don't do that, you're never going to get delivery, in my opinion. So chain those together. You have a few key partners really driving it forward. The Commonwealth is a brilliant forum for that. There's phenomenal convening power, and I think you can benefit the most, and I think drive that change and just demand the metrics and transparency, and we can get it done.
Important message. There's no shortage of pledges and promises in the world. It's all about actually delivering and acting on them. Minister, would you like to comment on some of the issues that we've been discussing, perhaps food security and agriculture, and the importance of the agriculture sector?
Yeah, thank you so much. First, to talk about the global economy, sometimes we take it as a unity, a standalone, but you have to remember that a global economy is coming from the sum of nations' economy. So meaning that if you have the sum of nations' economy and many countries are not doing well, the global economy will be always bad. But if you can make sure that the efficient countries are supporting the ones not doing well, so the global economy will be positive. So global economy is a sum of nations' economy. For that reason, the partnership is very important. Regarding food security, agriculture, and the other related issues, of course, if you see the situation in Africa, we are able to produce with difficult, even what you can consume in terms of productivity and productions. But if you see the resources we have, and those resources are there unused, I think there is a way to see now across the value chains, how can you be able to produce? You have seen the shocks we have had under Ukraine and the Russia war, for example, wheat. So we think as Africans, even under African free trade, it's time to make sure that we can produce together and make sure that we can create commodity exchange system. Let's take an example. In Zimbabwe now they are producing a lot of wheat. In Zambia the same, and the other countries. How can we create the efficiency along with the value chains we are doing together as Africans? And we are sure if we can do it, we'll be able even to have surplus to sell to others. So the food security, unfortunately, is here, but must not be here because resources there. What is remaining to see, how can we support each country to make sure that it can perform what we call specializations in terms of production, and then the comparative advantage around countries can exchange. There's a problem of exchange because infrastructures are poor, logistics is an issue, but I think with the vision we see in 2050, if we can be able to minimize the distance between us, and here I call again because if people can't move, good will not be able to move. I say this because if you see issues around the visa, around the mobility of people, and then say movement of people and goods, so good will be difficult because people, when they meet, they can discuss like we are here, and they can find solutions. I think we have to see how we can minimize the barriers, and unnecessary barriers we are creating to ourselves. Sometimes we take a shock as an external shock, but we have indigenous, I can say, endogeneity in our models in terms of the shocks we create ourselves as human beings. So we must eliminate them because we can't maximize what we do as long as, for example, we don't talk to each other, we don't collaborate, we don't partner. So external shocks are there. Climate change, they have said. We have others. We can't control pandemics, but what we can control is our behaviors of production, our behaviors of consumption, our behaviors of investment. So if we can change ourselves, for sure we'll be able to change what we see as global economy. Thank you.
There's a lot more to be said about this, but we're already out of time. That is how quickly it goes.
Wow.
Global uncertainty for sure. There's no shortage of answers, at least in principle, no shortage of pledges. It's all about getting things done and actually delivering on some of those. We will see what happens going into 2023. There will be more uncertainty, not less. Hopefully the world responds effectively, and hopefully the Commonwealth can take on some of that responsibility and deliver some of the action that we need to see. Please join me in thanking our speakers for that brief discussion. We will be moving into the next plenary on green finance in a few minutes. After that, there will be a break, so please bear with us. Join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Well
Thanks
done.
very much.
That was well moderated.
Thank you.